Thanks for joining us. The top stories today. The rally in tech stocks has slowed in recent days. Was Softbank speculation driving the rally? We're asking Nick Reese from Merck Investments. A Chinese state media article says China may start to sell off U.S. treasuries if U.S.-China tensions continue to escalate. Talk to Derek Scissors at American Enterprise Institute to see what's at stake. Is there fraud in California's unemployment system? People are receiving unsolicited letters, even debit cards, from the state's Jobless agency. We ask a fraud expert. And a heartwarming story. White House advisor Larry Kudlow opens up about how he recovered from drug and alcohol addictions. He spoke at an event in honor of National Recovery Month. The Labor Department's jobs report is out, and the U.S. economy added nearly 1.4 million jobs in August. Unemployment fell more than expected.
The Labor Department's closely watched jobs report shows that U.S. employers hired nearly 1.4 million people last month, and the unemployment rate fell to 8.4%. Economists polled by Reuters predicted the unemployment rate would fall to 9.8%. So the better-than-expected jobless number is an encouraging sign for the labor market recovery. Vice President Mike Pence wrote on Twitter, "The jobs report today shows that the American economy is coming back, and we need 4 more years of President Trump's policies that have laid the foundation for the remarkable V-shaped recovery that is taking place." The jobs report comes on the heels of Thursday's unemployment report. It showed that the number of Americans filing new jobless claims last week fell more than expected, breaking the psychological barrier of 1 million. And the number of people collecting unemployment dropped by 1.24 million in the week ending August 22nd, another encouraging labor market trend. It's boosting hopes for a stronger labor market rebound.
White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow told Bloomberg today that relief bill negotiations continue, as you might have guessed. But the U.S. can survive if a deal isn't reached by the end of the year. He says the economy is on a self-sustaining recovery and will continue to surprise on the upside. And I asked Mike Shedlock about the unemployment numbers today. He's an investment advisor at Sitka Pacific Capital Management. He's done the math and fears the real unemployment figure could be higher. He says the current economic environment is making it hard to get an accurate figure.
I'm not going to dispute the jobs number, but I am going to dispute their unemployment number. They published a number today that I think was pretty unbelievable. 8.4%, down from 10.2%. And the reason why I have a hard time believing this number is the way they produced this. It's based off of a survey taken during the 13th of the month, and that's the same survey that they do to come out with the employment numbers. And they came up with, in that week, in the reference week is what it's called, they came up with 14.9 million people on continuing state unemployment claims. That is the lowest number that we should possibly see, and I'll get to that in a moment. Instead, today, they reported 13.5 million unemployment claims when there's 14.9 million people collecting unemployment. So how can that be? And it's worse yet. The discrepancy is worse yet because there's a whole slew of people that aren't eligible for state claims. Those are gig workers. Those are people who are self-employed. There are people who have fallen off the rolls. In other words, they've been unemployed for so long they can no longer collect. Those people fall off. There is another almost 20 million people in this category, 13 million actually, in this category. And of them, some of them are unemployed, some of them are part-time workers. But of these 13 million people collecting pandemic assistance, and pandemic assistance only, I'm guessing at least 3 million of them are gig workers who are not working at all. If you add those two numbers together, I add that up, calculate the unemployment rate, I come up with something like 11.1. I actually believe that's on the low side, but certainly 8.4 is not in the ballpark at all if you just look at the data that the BLS is producing itself. So I don't believe this number that they came up with today.
And this type of discrepancy, is this something that you've just seen this month, or is this something to do with their methodology in general that should be revised?
The discrepancies happen all the time, but usually in a random fashion. In other words, you'll see discrepancies between the jobs report and the unemployment report. So in other words, there's two surveys. The payroll survey is an actual measure of what firms are billing, and the unemployment is based off of a household survey, which is a phone call actually. And they ask people whether or not they worked any hours this week. And guess what? If you claim you worked 1 hour, then you're considered employed. So we have these discrepancies all the time, and they tend to bounce back and forth. But what happens at economic turns, and we've certainly seen one here with COVID, we saw an economic turn in December of 2007 in the Great Recession, where these numbers get out of whack and stay out of whack. I think that's what's happening now, and the BLS is acting as if this is normal fluctuations, and their model is still based off of these normal fluctuations, when in fact we've headed into a deep recession and their models no longer work. And then what happens is a year or two, or sometimes even 3 years later, they go back and revise all these numbers and say, oh, guess what? The number we said was here, but the number's really here. I'm expecting massive revisions. They do this every year to make up for errors in their methodology. And their methodology is most wrong at economic turns, and we're in an economic return.
We'll definitely keep a marker on this conversation, Mish. Maybe we'll revise it in a year or two. We'll see how it looks. Mish, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
A pleasure to be on the show, and hope to be back again.
And concerns are growing that fraudsters are taking advantage of California's unemployment benefit system. One fraud expert says it's not just California. NTD's Phil Zoe reports.
When you see these types of unrealistic statistics, that's often a key indicator of fraud.
Californians are worried about unemployment fraud across the state. Some residents have received dozens of letters from California's unemployment agency. The letters have different names and social security numbers. Some even have debit cards. A California assemblyman says this is happening across the state. He tweeted, "Fraudsters are doing everything they can to get their hands on these envelopes because they know what's inside. Debit cards loaded with cash." The U.S. Department of Labor says California processed over 400,000 pandemic unemployment claims last week. That's more than half of all claims in the country. Fraud expert Frank McKenna told us California is not the first case.
About 33 additional states have reported being attacked by these fraud rings. So California is just the latest. My estimates are that unemployment fraud will run probably between 25 and 50 billion this year alone.
McKenna says scammers are taking advantage because states are not working together to crack down on the fraud.
When Washington clamped down on the fraud, they simply went to another state. So they went across the country to New York and some other states. They simply moved to the next easiest target. So it sounds like California was next in line.
In a letter to the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, California lawmakers approved an emergency audit of the state's unemployment department. The audit will look into the department's efforts to deliver unemployment benefits as well as backlogs and call center operations. Phil Zoe, NTD News.
Wall Street saw losses today with technology taking a hit. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook all down again. Nvidia was down over 3%, Zoom was down over 3%, but Broadcom gained after the Apple supplier forecast fourth quarter revenue above analyst estimates. The Dow was down over 159 points or 0.56%. S&P 500 lost over 28 points or 0.81%, and the Nasdaq dropped nearly 145 points or 1.27%. So just as the tech rally slows down, we learn that Japanese conglomerate Softbank has been betting big that tech stocks would rise. It's over the past few weeks. It's the Nasdaq whale that's buying all the call options. Before today, nobody knew who it was. Call options are basically bets the price will go up. But the banks who are taking those bets from Softbank need to protect against the risk of the prices actually going up and having to pay out big to Softbank. To do this, they actually buy the stock themselves. I asked Nick Reese if he thinks Softbank's actions could be behind the recent tech rally.
The FT put a story out that Softbank had been a big buyer of call options on some of the big technology stocks over the past month. And to try to put that into layman's terms, basically the way that the mechanics work for that is that if an investor comes in to buy options, buy call options in this case, from their brokers, the brokers stand ready to make a market in those options, and they will write the call options to those investors. And if they don't have a natural party that wants to be short those call options, they'll have to take that risk themselves. And so what they do to manage that is they hedge the risk of being short those call options by buying the underlying stocks. And so if those are the big tech stocks, then they would have been going into the market and bidding up the underlying stock prices, which could certainly have been a contributing factor to the big run-up that we saw in the big tech names over the past month.
And is there any correlation between this story coming out on FT and we saw some correction in the tech stocks yesterday and a little today?
Well, possibly. I mean, I think the tech stocks have had such a big run-up in the past few months that they were probably overdue for a correction. And what I noticed yesterday is a lot of sort of reaching around trying to find headlines or catalysts to provide a clean explanation for the correction. I don't think that's really necessary. The market can kind of, first of all, there are so many different market participants engaged in the market making decisions for different reasons with different motivations and constraints. And we see the residual of that in the prices on our screen. And 5 to 10 to 15% corrections tend to come out of nowhere and can happen for kind of no clear reason. And I think that's probably part of what we're seeing, that this market had just gotten ahead of itself and was overdue for a correction. And if you think about it, there's still plenty of worries and plenty of risks around for that to think that maybe the market could take a breather.
And have we seen the money going elsewhere over the past couple of days?
Well, it's been a classic risk-off week with equities down pretty much around the world and sovereign bond yields lower around the world. So that's kind of a classic flight to safety. So we've seen U.S. Treasuries appreciate in value. We've seen the U.S. dollar go up this week pretty much versus all of its major trading partners. And so it's been a classic risk-off with stocks down and sovereign bonds and the dollar higher.
It's been a while since we've seen you. Maybe you can weigh in on Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve's recent meeting and what you think the impact will be on inflation.
Right. So Powell last Thursday in his Jackson Hole speech talked about moving away from the existing framework, which is that they're always on a forward-looking basis targeting 2% inflation, and to this framework where they're going to say, if we've undershot it for a while, we're going to allow inflation to overshoot that 2% target for some period of time. He left it kind of vague on how they would, look at that in terms of a moving average or something. So that's deliberately left kind of vague as to exactly how they'll look at that. But it certainly implies that they're willing to let inflation run higher than the 2% target for some period of time, given that it's undershot that target in recent years. And we do see some of the market-based measures for inflation expectations reflecting an increase in what they think will happen. So, for example, on the 5-year forward-looking basis, the market's pricing about 1.9% inflation. So actually still below the 2% target, but that's definitely been moving consistently higher over the past few months. A lot of it, in the end of the day, will probably depend on fiscal policy. If fiscal policy continues to be very stimulative, especially with support and relief going to lower-income households, I do think we can see some consumer price inflation continuing in the months and years ahead.
Nick, appreciate your insights as always. Have a great weekend. Talk soon.
Thanks, Paul. You too.
President Trump announced today that Serbia and Kosovo have normalized economic ties. It's part of U.S. brokered talks. Belgrade will move its Israeli embassy to Jerusalem, and Israel and Kosovo have agreed to recognize each other.
I'm pleased to announce a truly historic commitment. Serbia and Kosovo have each committed to economic normalization.
The announcement follows 2 days of high-level talks between the leaders and senior Trump aides. and the historic pact forged by the Trump administration to normalize ties between Israel and the UAE. Serbia's president says there are still many differences, but the agreement is a huge step forward. Kosovo's prime minister also welcomed the pact. And still to come this evening. Will China weaponize its holding of U.S. government debt? We have analysis from China expert Derek Scissors at the American Enterprise Institute. And home sales surge in the UK. A record number of properties are being sold in less than a week. That and more after the break. Apple has published a new document on human rights policy saying it's committed to freedom of information and expression. The move follows increased pressure from its shareholders. The tech giant has come under fire for removing virtual network apps from its app in China, deleting an app that helps Hong Kong protesters track police, and using suppliers that allegedly use Chinese slave labor. In February, a shareholder proposal called on Apple to publicly commit to freedom of expression as a human right. The proposal was defeated in shareholder votes, but gained enough support to push the company to respond. And Chinese state media is threatening that China could start to sell their U.S. treasuries to hurt America. China is the world's second largest holder of U.S. debt. Ask Derek Scissors about it. He is a China expert and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I asked him if there are any ways that China could hurt the U.S. if it pushes forward with decoupling.
Yes, there are. Treasury bonds are not one of them. This is just something that sort of silly people in China and maybe some silly people in the U.S. still talk about. China's role in funding the U.S. deficit has dropped like a stone. One reason, unfortunately, is the U.S. deficit has gotten so much larger. And so the problem is so much bigger that China's contribution to solving it is very small. But the other reason is that China no longer runs large balance of trade surpluses. It used to be that China brought in a lot of money from its international activities. It had to invest it somewhere, and the only place that was big enough was the U.S. Treasury bond market. Now China doesn't bring in money anymore on a net basis, so it has nothing to invest. So it's not an important player any longer. That's a topic for 5 to 10 years ago. If the Chinese did try to sell, someone would buy the treasuries. Either they would buy them at face value or near face value, and it wouldn't make any difference, or the Chinese would have to cut the price, in which case they would absorb the losses, not the United States. So it's an empty threat put out by silly Chinese reporters following on Americans who also have a mistaken view of the situation. If China wanted to hurt the U.S., what they would do, and they've talked about this, but they've taken no action, is hurt U.S. company sales in China. China exports to the U.S. products made in China sent here. The U.S. counterpart to that is products made in China and sold in China by American firms. This upsets President Trump because he wants those to be exports. He wants the jobs to be in the United States. But for American firms, it's a very important source of revenue. And that's where the real retaliation would be. It would be saying to American firms who are making a lot of money in China, you can't do business here any longer. Now, the reason the Chinese haven't done that is those American firms tend to be their political allies in the United States. So they don't want to hurt their friends. But that's where the money is on the American side in the U.S.-China relationship now. It's not treasury bonds. Treasury bonds are old news.
And one bonus question. We see Apple have released a new human rights policy today, which will I believe, safeguard freedom of expression. You think it'll apply to China?
No. Apple, they know they're in a tough situation because they have set up a supply chain running through China where China plays a crucial role that is a very efficient chain. And it's very hard to replace. You don't just snap your fingers and say, oh, I'll just move to another country. You can do that with a little bit of your production, certainly, but to replace the production at China's scale requires time. It requires a lot of effort. You have to win the cooperation of other countries. So they know they're in a tough position. Even if Apple were deciding right now we needed to get out of China, and I have no knowledge of that. I'm just saying if they did, it would take years and a lot of money. So they're not in a position to take strong actions that would alienate the Chinese, because the Chinese would then interfere with their supply chain and Apple would be in considerable trouble. So I think this is one of those rules that Apple applies most of the world, but not in China. It has other rules like that with regard to censorship of applications and so on. And again, they're just in a tough situation now. If Apple had decided it wanted to move production out of China, that will take years, and they will not be able to adjust their policy to reduce their dependence on China for some time.
Derek, appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the new property report in the UK says 1 in 7 homes there are selling in less than a week. It's more than double last year. Pent-up demand and a new tax break are likely driving the sales.
Rightmove, the UK's #1 property website, has issued a new report saying that a record amount of properties are being sold since the tax cut was introduced in July. Sales between July and August reached a decade high. Property Mark CEO Mark Hayward agrees with the data.
Our own research showed that July was the highest number of sales since 2007.
The fastest rates of sales were in Scotland, and he said this was due to it having a longer lockdown period. It's been an August like he's never seen before.
August is traditionally a quiet month. It's certainly not a quiet month. And we've had a number of agents reporting that they've had their busiest and most productive month ever.
He also thinks the property purchase tax is a good thing and is continuing to lobby the government about it.
We've got a stamp duty holiday, which we campaigned strongly for, which I think has provided further impetus.
He said in order to take advantage of the tax break, which ends in March, you should sell in the next few weeks.
If you put your house on the market after September the 26th, you may not even meet the deadline of the 31st of March. But we're not, I don't believe, looking at a boom and bust scenario.
30% of homes are being sold within 2 weeks. 3-bedroom semi-detached houses are going the quickest. The tax break could save sellers up to about $20,000. Patrick Hayden, NTD News.
And still to come this evening. A heartwarming story in all the political uncertainty. Top economic advisor Larry Kudlow shares his drug recovery story. Hear how he got through his addictions after the break. Larry Kudlow's in the news a lot for his role in the Trump administration, but yesterday at a White House event, he shared how he recovered from his drug and alcohol addictions. The First Lady hosted the round table in honor of National Recovery Month.
National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow shared his personal story of recovery from drink and drug addiction at an event organized by First Lady Melania Trump on Thursday.
I was a hopeless abuser of alcohol and drugs. I had tried several times unsuccessfully to get sober.
Kudlow was fired from investment bank Bear Stearns in the mid-1990s as he struggled with cocaine addiction.
I went through bloody hell. I was unemployable.
But his addictions forced him to change, and he said by the grace of God he stayed married.
That it probably was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to change and seek a new path and return to faith.
He celebrated 25 years of sobriety in July. He said taking his current role working for the administration is the biggest honor of his professional career. His example is there for all those who are trying to come back from addiction.
For those who are still sick and suffering, you can. It's not easy, but you can get sober and you can stay sober and you can lead a productive life. And most importantly, hopefully like myself, we can learn to help other people.
He also has a message for employers.
Give us a chance. Please, give us a chance. That's all we ask.
He ended with a serenity prayer, and he said he hopes they can all stay on the happy road of destiny as sober men and women.
That's the latest business updates for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday.